The meltagon is also known as the melter, cooker, or vape gun. It works by submolecular thermal agitation in a manner comparable to microwave radiation. The target gets very hot and eventually cooks, melts, or just evaporates. A meltagon can melt plasteel or plascrete, and its effects upon living tissue are impressive to say the least. The weapon only has a short range, so it is used mostly for close assault and support. The meltagon makes no noise when fired, but the superheating of the air produces a distinctive hiss, which becomes a roaring blast as living targets are hit and their body's moisture vaporizes explosively. Hi, I'm Bits, your friendly neighborhood servo-doge, here to talk to you about Narrative Warhammer 40,000. Now, this may be a new topic for you if you're new to wargaming, or if you're new to the idea of narrative play. Or you're just here to yell at me in the comments, which is probably what you're already doing. So, let's go ahead and dive into narrative play. Or rather, let's talk about narrative as a whole, because when we look at Warhammer, this actually gets a little confusing for some. They confuse what I would consider to be the two types of narrative play with each other. The first is contextual narrative play. This is the framework that the game is built around, the ideas that the game uses to justify why things have the points cost they do through their stat lines, their special rules, even the war gear and the units available to them, which can inform also how you play. For example, the fluff around the white scars tells you that they're a highly mobile force that likes bikes. This is, generally why when people want to play armies with bikes, they tend to play white scars. This is contextual narrative design. This is what helps inform you as the player, which informs your decisions, which also informs how you play them. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. This is what most of us engage with all the time, from when we pick an army, to assembling a list, to building a playstyle around that list. These are the ideas that also inform the rules of the game, and also tell us things like why a Space Marine, thanks to the being transhuman, demigods that are, the children of Primarchs, in effect. I know this isn't gross oversimplification, but basically why they're more tough and strong and fast compared to humans. And this is the thing that most people think about when they first approach narrative. It's like, oh, I'm playing an army that specializes in high mobility, so all my guys ride bikes or ride in transports, and we all go really fast. And there is nothing wrong with that. That is perfectly fine to play. For example, Evil Sun's orcs play exactly that way. They bring lots of bikes, they bring lots of buggies, and they bring lots of trucks to throw all their other guys into, so that way those other guys can make it to different points on the table and hold those objectives, or take the objectives away from other people. But what most people, once you get past that, think of narrative play is they actually think of campaign. And this is where I would say the role-playing side of narrative play comes in, the second form of narrative. And this is something that actually goes back into, for Warhammer, it goes back to its roots. But for wargaming, it actually goes back even further. You see, in historical wargaming, a lot of the games that were played were recreations of battles. Or, when it was used as a tool by the military, it was used to create scenarios, or recreate those battles, to test the tactical acumen of their various officers they're training, as well as sharpen the possibilities, even try to take a more, not necessarily a ground level view, but rather take a step back and be able to see the whole battlefield as a single unit and organize the battle that way. This was incredibly useful. In fact, there's a number of games such as Go, chess, shogi, and I'm certain others, possibly even checkers to be honest, I'm not entirely sure on that one, that are designed around abstracting this tactical play, from capturing pieces, such as what you see in chess, or controlling territory, which is what Go was based around. And these different sort of ideas also play out in wargaming, which tends to lean more towards the simulation side of war, or abstracting the war, or battle, or whatever you're recreating. Now, What's interesting, though, is, and this may have happened before, but we definitely know of one example for sure, people would also create alternate histories around these wars. In fact, the group that eventually went on to form Dungeons & Dragons as an actual game did this. And I have a little link down in the description below called What's a Grognard by Zbashu, or maybe it's Zbash, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. That is great coverage of where both one of our, most common terms come from, but also discusses the ideas that formed into D&D. But these ideas also went on to feed back into Warhammer. Now, to explain that, I need to talk about a little bit about the history about Warhammer. See, Games Workshop started making miniatures for games, and one of the games they made miniatures for, among others such as Judge Dredd, was Dungeons & Dragons. And this eventually led them to saying, hey, we should make a game using the miniatures we have, so people can both have an excuse to have more miniatures, but also have other ways to use these miniatures other than just in Dungeons & Dragons, which became Warhammer Fantasy. And then they decided they wanted to tap into the science fiction market because they had Judge Dredd. I actually don't remember all the games that they had, but they had a few science fiction based games under their label at the time. And we're leaning into that and also, exploring ideas of making things like adventurers that kind of fit this general scheme of, multiple different kinds of games. And they wanted to reuse those for a game as well. And that was what led to Warhammer 40,000. What's interesting is Warhammer 40,000 basically took the idea of a war game as a role-playing game and recreated it with a whole brand new system of its own, unlike the one that was used, by the group that made D&D, because they had converted a system from being a Civil War game to a Napoleonics game. Warhammer 40,000, with the Rogue Trader edition, built its own system from the ground up as a role-playing device. And this idea of a war game as role-playing continues into campaigns, which is where the role-playing was being done before Warhammer came around for wargaming. The idea is that you can create stories with your models and your friends. And it doesn't have to be a big event. You don't have to fight on Armageddon. But to use Armageddon as an example, Captain Tycho, the somehow, most vain blood angel to exist, considering that he went into the Black Rage thanks to getting, psychically puked on and becoming less pretty, is the result of somebody's campaign or battle report or other game playing out, and a warp head psychically vomiting on him, and the character going down, and that the players deciding how that played out. These are the sort of things we can dive into, not even necessarily leaning on Games Workshop's Crusade rules, but just as a general rule of thumb, you can kind of discuss these things as a group, or just make jokes with your friends. I mean, one of the little ways you can add both contextual narrative and lean into this campaign narrative is adding trophies to your models. If you have a Space Marine who's been fighting a lot of orcs, well, some orc skulls will look great on his base. Likewise, you can also form actual stories. Let's say you want to tell the story of a small system on the edge of the galaxy, maybe near Tau space, so that way you can include, your friend into, a narrative that they may not normally be included into otherwise. And by doing this, you can go, okay, we have this little system, it's high in resources, it's got a human world on it, the Tau want it, humanity wants it, the Votan want the resources, the Necrons are living on one of the other planets and just want to be left alone, the Tyranids have a splinter fleet sent there, there's a Gene Stealer cult calling the Splinter Fleet, the Orcs just showed up out of nowhere because a Void Whale vomited up their rock, and you can kind of just include everybody into this fight now. And you didn't have to, thanks to the magic of the way Warhammer structures why everybody's there, is really easy to get everybody involved and go, okay, we have everybody involved, and to play out a series of games over the course of a few weeks between various players and determine the fate of this little planet and this system. and that's a great way to do narrative play. But it's a way that requires a little bit more investment because you have to be playing with the goal not to win the hardest, but to tell a good story. And this kind of goes back to a mantra that I have about narrative play, and that's you cannot min-max a story. You can definitely min-max your army. In fact, you can play skewless, which are the peak of min-maxing. But the general idea is that you want to set the story up in a way that makes it more interesting to play through and, doesn't have an obvious winner from the get-go. For example, we can go back to the White Scars. Well, they form a great skew army. They're fast, but they don't have a lot of numbers because bikes don't have a lot of models. You have to pay for transports for the guys who are on foot. And then you can also center your entire playstyle around recreating that hit and run style, forcing you to think of the game in a way that matches their manner of war over what would win you the game the best. Now, that's not to say that you have to play intentionally foolishly, unless you decide that your commander is an actual idiot, which could be quite fun as well. For example, we had Hermann von Straub of Armageddon, who was a corrupt imperial governor who sided with some orcs in an attempt to, oust Yarick, also known as the Old Man of the Imperium. But Straub was an idiot. Straub was a horrible commander, and that's why he was ousted in the first place and had to go into hiding and try to lead that coup by siding with Xenos, which would have gotten him killed anyways by the Imperium. But you can lean into that. You can lean into that idea of playing a corrupt, foolish leader who makes bad decisions, as long as you're playing in a way that also makes the game interesting. And you can even house rule things where it's, say if he gives out an order, it has to be you can intentionally pick ones that are the least useful and, have the unit he's ordering pass a battle shock test. And if they fail, they disobey his order and instead pick a different order that makes more sense for what you're trying to do. This is a narrative sort of thing that would require planning and agreement with your opponent. But when you're playing, narrative games, that's a great time to bust out little flavorful things like that don't necessarily give you an advantage, but twist the way the game plays in a way that keeps it interesting. This is why narrative games are more commonly going to use unique terrain rules, such as fighting in the void or fighting in heavily snow-covered terrain that affects your movement. It's also why narrative games will tend to also include weather, because weather is a massive factor in war, but is usually left out of the more competitive side of the game because it screws with the predictability and tactical play, because nobody wants to lose a unit because you decided the game should have massive thunderstorms and, any model with a sword pointed in the air is at risk of being struck by lightning every turn. Incredibly funny if it happens, but not really something that competitive play wants to use. So the general idea, if I'm going to summarize, is that we have two major types of narrative, and these are usually confused with each other in discussion. Contextual narrative is the kind of narrative that every single player is participating in all the time. It's the thing that most competitive players will point at when they say that the game is already narrative. It is the thing that they will also point out when they say that they're playing fluffy lists. And they're not wrong. They are. But when we're taking a step back from that competitive side of the game, that's where the role-playing side of narrative comes in. And that's where we can do things like form alliances, tell campaign stories, or just, put a little spin on the game that we're playing with something, unique and probably house-ruled. Now, this doesn't mean you have to use Crusade rules. And in fact, I am going to be reviewing Crusade rules later in this edition as soon as I can get my copy in. I've pre-ordered at the time of this recording, but Games Workshop tends to send my pre-orders about a week late, so we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'd like to give a special Now, of course, before I go, I'm going to give a special shout out to the fine folks over on Patreon who've been paying me money to help support the show. That would be... Now, before I go, let's go ahead and give a special shout out to the fine folks at Patreon, because these sort of things cost money, and speaking of pre-orders, those do not come freely, unfortunately. So, and of course, I appreciate the fine folks on Patreon who help me afford these pre-orders, so that way I can continue to make content for you. That would be folks like Huzzah, That One Kriegsman, Paradur, The Bearmex, Aaron Johnson, Brendan Chimmy. That would include folks like Huzzah, That One Kriegsman, Paradur, The Bearmex, Aaron Johnson, Brendan Chimmy McGuire, Darth Vol, Ava, Fritz, Lath Balrog, Maroon Knight 14, Nova Biscuit, 3Gs, Zedizig, Aaron O.C., Dahl, Franklin Hall, Freeman Faust, Greg Bond, Hobby Sasquatch, Janet Wicks, Camille Avila, Kit Kat, Luke Ellett, Nimbus, Patricia, Patrick M., Poswaldo, Raptor Shadow, Ross Fisher Davis, Ryan Baker, Sanguine, Sean the Neurodivergent Crafter, Tim Nightrider, Torrent of the Papyrus, Warhammer, and Yorgi Darkwing. And if you too would like to have your name butchered at the end of every episode, feel free to hop over to Patreon, link in the description below, where the money helps go towards funding this channel. If monetary donations aren't your thing, or if you just want to help even further, like, comment, and subscriptions helps feed that hungry YouTube algorithm. Now, of course, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I don't have a catchy sign-off phrase, so I'm just going to randomly stop as I trail off into nothingness.